Angela.
Welcome, everyone. I love seeing your chats coming in. We've got folks from all over the world, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are so pleased that you're here with us today. If you missed Sue's introduction, I'm Angela Passarelli, the Director of Research at the Institute of Coaching, and it's my great pleasure to be here today with my mentor, my collaborator, and my dear friend, Dr. Richard Boyatzis. We're thrilled that you can join us for this conversation. As many of you are already doing, I invite you to say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're zooming in from. And as Sue mentioned, we will use the chat today for you to interact with one another and for technical questions that you might have. But if you have questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A box. I will be monitoring that and moderating, be your voice to ask your questions after Richard delivers his remarks. Many of you know Richard, so he hardly needs an introduction. In fact, I've been warned not to do a lengthy introduction because you all want to hear from him. So I'll just hit a few highlights. Richard is a distinguished university professor and a professor of organizational behavior, psychology, and cognitive science at Case Western Reserve University. He's been studying coaching and helping relationships since 1967 and practicing as an executive coach since 1969. He's a prolific scholar. He's published 10 books, including the most recent, Helping People Change, more than 200 academic articles and hundreds of practitioner articles on topics about leadership, emotional and social competency development, and of course, on coaching. He has earned numerous awards, and so I want to be short, but I'd be remiss if I don't mention at least one. And one that I'm particularly proud of for him is that he was recently named to Stanford University's list of the top 2 scientists in the world. So to be included on this list means that he is one of the most cited scientists, not just in his discipline, but across all academic disciplines for faculty for the length of their careers. And today's talk is unique because it's not just about his work, but it's about the entire field of coaching scholarship. He'll discuss where we are as a field in terms of our evidence base and our theorizing, and also where we need to go, as he shares insights from a convening of the world's preeminent coaching researchers that was sponsored by the ICF's Thought Leadership Institute last fall. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Boyatzis.
Thank you, Angie and Sue. And Angie, just a minor correction. I'm not in the top 2. It was the top 2%.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the percent.
No, it's okay. I mean, it's nice to be thought of as the top 2, but that would put me in Nobel Prize territory, and I've never been considered for that. So anyway,
you haven't yet.
At any rate, well, thank you. And you know, I've enjoyed IOC since its founding, and now that both the Coaching Research Lab and ICF are in an alliance with IOC, we're all looking forward to a lot more interactions. I'm going to, if you don't mind, share my screen so you can follow it. And as I believe all of the slides will be available to you. So, you know, you don't have to take a lot of notes, but on the other hand, it's also all being done off of this particular article. So let me just start. Why do we do research? I mean, all of us involved in coaching know how much it sometimes often moves other people and how good we feel about helping others. So the whole question about research sometimes feels like, why are you bothering with all of this minutiae when we know we're on a mission? It's because it's so popular, because it feels so good, we have an extra responsibility to make sure that we are performing our coaching services with the intellectual integrity it needs. In a sense, we're looking to make sure we build the foundation for what we're doing and trying to help others. Now, the reason for that is that intention is not the same as outcomes. I mean, in our recent set of studies and in our Melvin Smith's and Ellen Middleton's in my book, Helping People Change, we spent a lot of time going over studies showing how very often people are well intentioned when they're coaching, but it comes across or is experienced by the recipient as what we call coaching for compliance, or the person feels more like a coaching bully than a really compassionate helper. And the other reason is coaching, like any very popular, very positive endeavor, attracts an awful lot of fads. And some of them are mirrors and blue smoke. I mean, in the medical field, it doesn't take long to go backwards and remember that people thought bloodletting was the way to get the bad humors out of a person's system, or the importance of knowing the bumps on your skull for phrenology. Of course, the modern day version of it, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but to the extent that how precise can astrology be? But in the behavioral area, they are rife. Now, I'm only going to mention a few because if I start to mention some of the other ones that have been debunked, there might be people who get bent out of shape in the audience because they're still believing in it. But we now have plenty of evidence to say all of the billions spent in the self-esteem movements and the public education efforts in California in particular, um, 2 decades ago, really didn't help much. And it wasn't that we don't need to have self-esteem. It was that the programs were misdirected around it. And then, of course, Ned Herman was a great guy, as a friend of mine, and I really enjoyed him and his work. But the whole right brain, left brain has now been debunked. I mean, every part of our brain has rights and lefts, and they do different things. So very often, when people were trying to simplistically characterize, oh, your right brain or oh, your left brain, they were actually talking about different networks that go in and out of all parts of the brain. So why research? It's that. It's to help make sure that we're doing the right thing, but then also to help us autocorrect. Now, what can you do? It sounds funny to start the session this way, but I'm going to end it with the same slide. As a result of this, there are 4 things you can do to help advocate for our intellectual integrity as coaches. And as coaching scholars, you can actually directly do. 1, read the full article that this session is based on. There's the DOI. It's open, free access. You just tap on that and you'll get the article from the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science. Then Thought Leadership Institute has the videos of the convening sessions, which I'll explain in a moment. On our website, if you tap on this hot link, you'll go to the Global Digital Library of the Thought Leadership Institute, and you'll have access to the videos and even 24, short 1-page, 1.5-page practitioner summaries of some of our implications. So one is to read more, study more. The second thing is to actually get involved in research. And if you are a scholar, if you're in the healthcare profession, you do a lot of clinical and translational research. Here's an opportunity to get involved in the relational and helping parts of it. And if you don't have the facilities yourself to do research, reach out. And there are plenty of scholars, faculty who love colleagues, and it gives you a chance to do some research and publish. The other thing you can do is help those of us doing the research by volunteering and periodically completing surveys, participating in studies. We all need people who are in coaching, that are doing real coaching, to help us. There was an article published just about 6 months ago saying why coaches don't like to participate in research. Well, I'm hoping that if you're so interested in these ideas and advancing it that you're on this webinar, you'll say, okay, I owe it to myself in the field to give an hour a month or something in helping others do research. And of course, lastly, if you can't give your time, then give your money, which is kind of the motto of nonprofits. I'm putting that last because I'm not assuming that would be actually the thing that would help us, but it could. It could help by helping to sponsor the research. Okay, so now enough of the preamble. The Thought Leadership Institute is one of the 6 family organizations in the IFC and the revised confederation that ICF created a few years ago. Those of us who are on the founding board of the Thought Leadership Institute, we were created to help think beyond into the future, not just about coaching, but about world and social problems. We chose 5 pillars of the work we're doing. one is the future of coaching, one is the future of work, one is the future of education, one is the future of social policies and social justice, and one is the future of the planet and ecology. We decided that one way we could help to foster this was to convene what we called wisdom weavers, which were people involved in research and writing about these topics to talk. For the future of coaching, because we knew the networks a lot more, we invited 35 of the most recognized coaching scholars, published authors, and another 12 coaching leaders to 3 2-hour conversations, which we convened the first, second, and third week in September, different times of the day or night, so we catered to the different parts of the world. Each 2-hour session began with 3 presenters giving about a 15-minute talk about their view of kind of what we know from research and what we think we need to know or find out in the coming research years. We then opened up, we had small group discussions and then the plenary. And those videos, like I said, are available at the Thought Leadership Institute website. But what we decided is the important way to reach scholars and students, graduate students, and even undergraduates who might be teased into thinking about doing coaching research is to write a scholarly paper. So we wrote it up, and the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science, which is a both scholarly and applied practical scholar journal, published it. And what we came up with and what we started the design of the 3 sessions, one on what are the desired outcomes of coaching? Because there is a real serious question, is coaching effective? Or when is it effective and for whom? And then what are the processes and mechanisms of coaching that work? The third was, what about coaching for people from distinctive cultures or not as much distinctive genders, but as all of the genders and other forms of context like different faith groups? What came up in the conversations, which was such a strong theme around the competencies of effective coaches, that de facto became a 4th theme. These are not the only things of interest in coaching. We're hoping the next future of coaching research could look at team coaching. We may even have a section on artificial intelligence, and maybe, who knows, a section on peer coaching. But we thought that these were the first ones we needed to address. So let me go through each one of them. I'll say a little bit about what were the kinds of issues raised in the discussion and the presentations, and then what did we come out with as the recommendations for needed research in the coming years. Well, the outcomes started with the fundamental question, does coaching work? Another way to ask that is, what are the indicators of effective coaching? The problem is when we use an indicator like client satisfaction, which is an important indicator, but it could be the result of cognitive dissonance reduction. I've just invested all this time and money, it must have been useful. Those of us in the field, are humbled by remembering, and having been trained as a psychotherapist and having done psychotherapy in the 70s, I can honestly say I remember the work of Eysenck in the 60s showing that when people went through the talking cure of psychotherapy in the UK, and they matched them, the National Health Service had long waiting lists then as well, they matched them randomly to people who got the 1 year of therapy versus people on the waiting list. And what they found at the end of the year is that both groups had improved about the same amount. Very humbling. And we get a lot of that kind of research when we really test the outcomes. Well, fortunately, we have had a number of studies done on coaching outcomes. And I know we have a number of reviews, meta-analyses they're often called, or reviews of the ones. I just reviewed one for a journal just now that I think is the 5th one to be done, and I'm hoping it gets published within the next 6 months, because that focused on randomized control group studies, which is the ultimate in efficacy testing. But one of the things we know is that when you actually look at a number, and this last one was able to document 34 randomized control group studies, that we do know that client satisfaction is higher, and with both the coach and the coaching process. We know that clients' intention to act on and expecting changes on specific goals as a result of coaching is a positive effect. We know in one particular study that improved sense of well-being was dramatically shown in terms of statistical testing. We know from another study that was done in Barcelona at ESADE that a person can have a significant improvement on their personal dream, their vision of the ideal future as a result of coaching. And then Margaret Moore, one of the co-founders of IOC, reported on a plethora, if you will, of health outcomes and quality of life measures related to that coming from the coaching done in health fields. So this gives us confidence that yes, coaching is effective. But compared to the amount of time and money spent on coaching as an intervention, these are a very small number of studies. So we started out with the first desire is we need more outcome studies. But now what we need to ratchet up is we need studies that use multiple outcomes, not just one measure of did it work or not. We have to also, in looking at this, see if we can incorporate more behavioral measures. To date, I think all but in the healthcare area, all of the measures are self-report. And while self-report is valuable, we also know that it can be affected by, again, cognitive dissonance reduction or social desirability or all sorts of other things. So one of the things that we're suggesting is that when people design the studies, they use good scientific method, which is to say, have some self-assessment or self-report dependent variables, but also have some that are behavioral, that somebody else is measuring it, including psychophysiological. And of course, eventually it'd be nice to have some of these studies, more and more of them done, that are looking at a variety of outcome measures in the same study. So we can start to look at how some clients and some processes will work on some outcome measures and not others, and vice versa. When we think about this, we have to be careful as scientists, as scholars, that the dependent variables are measured with something that is sensitive to change. So it has both the psychometric rigor right now that have shown improvement, but oddly enough, one that hasn't been shown yet is people actually changing their behavior. So we're looking forward to that. And then, of course, as scholars, we know that we're not just looking for one of these, we're looking for more of them with replications. And that will help us with more confidence. And then this drives all the rest of the research questions, because we need the same research conducted with a variety of different kinds of clients around the world. We need it with different coaching approaches, and we need it with different coaches. And again, there is a lot more on these in some of the other grand challenges. The second grand challenge was on the process and mechanism of coaching. What happens when we peek behind the curtain? It's like making the whole trip to Oz. Now we want to look behind the curtain. And is it just this, little person with a large megaphone? Or is the actual thing of what goes on inside of a person's heart, body, mind, something that we can understand? Because we often find that practitioners or even scholars will promote one particular approach to coaching, and most people don't have a self-confidence problem, so they'll of course think theirs is superior to others. But without actual rigorous research making that claim, and that's more than just did you like it, client satisfaction, I think we have to ask the question in the context of some careful, if you will, program evaluation, testing approaches against each other and against comparison control groups. Two of the presenters in particular, Melvin Smith and Angela Passarelli, talked about an approach of coaching with compassion, which is coaching to the positive emotional attractor state, psychophysiologic state, versus coaching for compliance, which is what often is well intended, but the recipient feels like the person is, again, I said in the extreme, a helping bully, but they're trying to get you to fit into somebody else's view. The process and mechanism raises the question of dosage. How long should a coaching session last? How many of them should you have? How long should the coaching relationship go? And how frequently should you have it? I remember in the mid 70s when I was heavily involved with research as well as intervention work in helping alcoholics. One of the questions that came up was short versus longer term psychotherapy. And a set of very impressive studies were done by a professor from Pittsburgh at the time called Chad Emmerich. And he showed that the duration didn't matter. The approach didn't matter of what kind of psychotherapy. What mattered the most were the skills, or what we call the competencies, of the therapist. And then we had from Rick DeHaan and his colleagues' work some marvelous beginning work and documented studies on the critical moments, the micro moments of discovery that occur during a coaching process. Their research is setting the stage for people to now go in and look at this with a lot more detail. But it's a very helpful approach to it, because it says, we can't, when we want to do inferential work of testing causality, we very often have to use multiple methods. We have to use qualitative as well as quantitative, because a person might not know that they, excuse me, they just had a critical moment when something like this happens. Excuse me. And then Angie, in her presentation, did talk about the neurobiological, both hormonal as well as neural network activations and mechanisms. And then, of course, you can't approach the process without thinking of artificial intelligence. And particularly Nikki Terblanche of the University of Stellenbosch has been writing about, how the use of, in his case, he's using some coaching bots, can help complement the coaching relationship, not kind of substitute. So what did this lead to in terms of research needs? Well, our sense was we need research on these critical moments or micro moments, these moments in which a person's eyes open up and it's like there are the variety of oh my God moments. As Angela had talked about, we need to incorporate more psychophysiological and even neurobiological variables so we understand what's going on in the body, because very often that happens in thousandths of a second, way below consciousness, but helps us to judge what will emerge into the person's consciousness later, hopefully. We need to be able to understand the various approaches to using artificial intelligence. Bots is just one way, but there might be others. I'm sure there'll be others to come. We also decided that we need to understand the mediating or moderating role of the quality of the relationships. Now, sometimes that's been called the relationship alliance. We use the quality of relationships in some of the work we do with the Coaching Research Lab, looking at variables like shared vision and shared compassion and shared energy. And the folks out of Michigan use high quality connections. So regardless of which approach you use, we think we have to look at that. But when you think about other moderators and mediators, I'm not sure we're going to get to this quickly, but at some point we have to look at other critical things that affect our lives, like sleep, the quality of your sleep, the duration, nutrition, and the role of physical exercise. We know that a number of these things will require equipment that very often coaches don't have. Fortunately for all of you doing this in healthcare environments, very often you'll have access to various devices that can help measure these things. And we're hoping that we create more of a crossover and collaboration with people in different institutions to do this kind of coaching research. And the last thing we thought about that was very important is we're going to need a lot more to understand the acute experiences of trauma and the variations of burnout versus post-traumatic growth. Certainly, none of us would have predicted 2.5 years ago that we would have been through a worldwide pandemic, and the likes of which we haven't seen in 100 years. So we already have going on trauma, but we also have the horrible trauma occurring from people in war zones. We have the horrible trauma from people in that are embattled with gang violence in various both parts of the world and inner cities. And we have people suffering from family, physical, or psychological abuse, in addition to physical trauma. So, Grand Challenge 3. Right now, we spend a lot of time on the competencies of coaches. We have competency models, the ICF does, and most of the other, any association that certifies people has a competency model. Most organizations that do training have a competency model. Now, here's the kicker. Not one of those models is validated on empirical research. And don't, okay, before you get all defensive, doing surveys of people's values is not empirical research for this purpose. It's descriptive. And what it tends to do is it tends to reify current cultural myths. I mean, I was doing this on managers. I was collecting data on what managers thought they needed to be effective managers. And then I was actually going in and leading groups through my former research company, McBurn Company, that we were looking, and we started doing this in 1970, looking at the competencies of different levels of managers, from supervisory to executives, where we used multiple effectiveness measures. When you compared the list of competencies that were validated from the multiple effectiveness measures with the competencies identified by Delphi techniques and surveys of existing managers or trainers or HR people, what we found was very humbling. 50% of them had an overlap. 25% of the things identified in the surveys and value methods were irrelevant. They didn't matter one way or another. And 25% were opposite to the things that predicted effectiveness measures. So we are all well intended. Look, nobody has started any of these efforts in training or certification without wanting to improve quality and guide people. But it's time that we actually started measuring these things and feeling on safer ground. Why? Because I'm afraid we're wasting time. We're spending maybe 50% of the time in training that we don't need to spend, and we should be focusing on other things, and 50% of the time in the certifications on some of the things that are not as relevant when we could be devoting more times to the things that are more powerful. So I think what we have to do is focus on, since 1970 and my work with David McClelland, our term competencies is really used as capabilities. In Italia, I don't use the term competenze, I use capacità. And in the UK, we just say capabilities, because very often when people hear the word competencies, they hear it as proficiencies. So we're talking about an underlying characteristic. So what do we need to do this? We need some research on coaching outcomes. We need to understand what competencies of coaches are predicting actual client change and desired outcomes. So to do that, we have to measure the competencies of the coaches, and we have to measure some client outcomes. Now, this is a very, very laborious process, because having measured competencies, capabilities for now 50 years, 52 years, I can tell you that self-report is delusional. I mean, Ed Hollander showed that in the 50s. And we know from work of Leanne Atwater and Scott Taylor and others that professional women tend to be underestimators and professional men tend to be overestimators of their own competencies. So we need what are called behavioral measures of competencies. What do other people see? Or what are you coding off of videos or audios or actual behavior to assess the competencies? Secondly, on client outcomes, we need multiple. So we have to look at not just things like client satisfaction and goal intention, but we also have to look at whether or not other people think these clients' behaviors have changed. Have their visions or dreams changed? We all know as coaches that can be some of the most potent ways we reach people. We have to know whether or not people's quality of relationships are changing. So we need to be careful about the measures of the competencies. We have to be attentive to multiple outcomes of actual client change. And this is going to require longitudinal studies. Once we do this, we may be able to determine which of the competencies determine the effective coaches from the average or mediocre or just starting coaches, and which are the characteristics that we call thresholds you need to enter the field. The reason is that threshold competencies are a lot more amenable to didactic approaches. You can learn them by studying something, watching videos, MOOCs, other kinds of things. But when you actually get into training, into practice, into supervision, into feedback, that's where you're working. You want to be working on the competencies that really differentiate effectiveness. Sorry, I may talk more about this than the others, but this is what I've been working on for an awful lot of my life, so I have to know a lot about it. Um, I'll just foreshadow. I started a study like this 3 years ago. We're still trying to collect enough data from coaches. So I can personally attest to how difficult it is to get enough coaches who then can get enough clients to be willing to each, the coach is spending 35 minutes filling stuff out, but the client's spending 20. Anyway, we need these studies. I'm not saying anybody is going into these competency models. Of course, we're all well intended. And I know Michael Cavanaugh was talking about having been heavily involved in doing this for the entire country in many of the regions of Australia, that, we need these models, so we create them in the best way we can, as that's what Joel DiGirolamo has done for ICF. But the problem is it's now time for us to go beyond the value-based or the surveys to some of these inferential approaches. The last challenge I'm going to talk about today is how do we help understand coaching and coaching effectiveness for people from different cultures, different ethnicities, different genders, in a larger sense, different faiths, almost any way you describe context. We feel context matters. And from every imaginable way you can think of, context matters. But for example, one of the things we hypothesize, but we need the research, is a lot of times people come up with what's called the matching hypothesis. This comes out of the field of psychotherapy and social work. And that means that if you're a single mother and you want to have a therapist or a coach, you would really do much better with a single mother who is a therapist or a coach. Or if you're African American, you do better with an African American. If you're a member of the Islamic faith, you do better with a coach who's Islamic. This is called the matching hypothesis. The dilemma is in the field of psychotherapy and in counseling, like social work counseling, the matching hypothesis is shown just not to be true. It doesn't matter, which is to say, a really good coach doesn't have to have lived the experience to be able to help somebody else learn about themselves and develop. The meta-analysis that I just read, which I can't say anything more about because it hasn't been published yet, but it found overall a bias that suggested that, not horrendously strong, but enough to say it was statistically significant, that on the whole, women make better coaches than men in these meta-analysis studies. But it doesn't matter what the gender or gender identification of the client was. So we need work to establish this. We need to prove that this either doesn't matter or it does matter in coaching. And then at the level that we need is, I know Christian van Nieuwenburg has done a number of studies with some colleagues of his, showing how the process of coaching may be different in Islamic countries or for Islamic clients, because very often it's not their individualistic work performance that's the major context for why they come to coaching. It might be their family relationships and their faith. We also, as Melvin Smith and Margaret Moore championed in these conversations, we need to get clearer about the interactions of how coaching has an impact and how it starts to work with or on top of institutional or organization development. Because most of us these days are talking about how do we develop a culture of coaching or a culture of development. I wrote about this in we wrote about this in chapter 8 of helping people change. We think every organization needs a culture of development that parallels their culture of performance, not replaces it, but parallels. But because of neurological differences as to what happens when you're into each one of these modes, it turns out that you can't do them at the same time. So you have to create two complementary cultures. That's going to be a challenge for us. We hope we can spur a certain amount of thinking and coaching about these things. That is the summary. These are the research studies we had. I just summarized them in. And then, of course, applying this not just to institutions, but to all sorts of issues, broader issues of social justice and inclusiveness and equity. So what can you do individually? Read more about this. Think about it. Reach out and touch someone. I don't mean in a way that violates HR principles, but just form a relationship and collaborate with somebody that you can work with on some research, or help us by volunteering and participating. Every one of us doing these studies is desperate for more people to spend a little bit of time helping us. So let me stop my screen sharing and say and open it up. Angie, where do you want to go from there? Oops, you're muted, Angie.
Thank you. And thank you, Richard. What I was saying was thank you for putting this together for us, a very provocative talk. There's a lot of conversation, both in chat and also in the Q&A, about what you've said. And for those of you who are participating with us, I'd just remind you, if you have a question for Richard, please don't put that in the chat, put that in the Q&A box. And I'm going to try to summarize some of these things. Richard, very early on, a couple of the questions that I saw in both places had to do with the turn toward digital in coaching, with bots, with AI informed coaching. And so I'd like to just hear you talk a little bit more about both where you believe we are in terms of understanding the role of AI in coaching and where you think we can go.
Well, since you introduced it both in terms of the digital media, let me start with coaching via Zoom or meetings or whatever it is, but online. Angie, you're one of the co-authors of a major study on modalities of coaching, and with folks who were mid-level managers of a certain age cohort. I mean, you found that although they loved face-to-face, actually telephone was a little more powerful for them than video. I seem to recall that being the findings from your several papers. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, face-to-face was still better than telephone, but telephone, and this was, again, before Zoom, so there's some, right. I mean, before the pandemic, so there might be some level of...
And actually, that's what I wanted to focus in on. First of all, the average age of those folks were older, and they certainly worked with computer, but yeah. And the study was done, what, 6 years ago or something, so... Today they'd be in their 50s. But I remember talking to Nilofar Godes, who was in charge of coaching at Cisco Systems, and she said their people are so into digital communication that they find coaching over Zoom or telepresence or any of these systems to be as natural as face-to-face. So and now post-COVID, I would say a lot more people have gotten a lot more comfortable with it. I suspect that coaching one-on-one via some digital platform where you can see each other and hear each other clearly is probably going to end up being, when we do the research, as effective as face-to-face for those people who grow up being technology oriented.
Well, and Richard, that's exactly what we found in that study, even pre-pandemic, that the moderating factor for folks was their efficacy with technology. So if they felt confident and comfortable troubleshooting if there's an issue or reconnecting if there's a disconnection, that the differences between the communication channels actually disappeared for folks
Right,
who are high in
right.
efficacy and
Okay.
technology. So,
So that's one place where the digital helps. And I've got to say, from the point of view of how do you maximize renewal and minimize the damage of stress on the coach, you don't have the commute time. You could actually coach a number of people in a day. You don't lose a half a day getting to their offices or getting on a plane and flying to another city.
mhm.
Um, and so for the coach, there's a benefit around a lot of, excuse me, reducing a lot of this stress. Sorry. In terms of other digital forms, I mean, Nikki Terblanche is very eloquent about this, that he thinks that coaching bots uh, are already at the stage where they could be helpful to complement face-to-face coaching. And because you and I and Kylie Rochford are doing a series of studies with Nikki using a bunch of a newly designed coaching bot to look at that complementary aspect. And we're going to test it both as pre-work and as supplementary after the person-to-person coaching. It is very likely that we will discover the aspects and kinds of ways that can help. One of Nikki's attractions to this is how do we democratize it so that coaching can come not to the 500,000 most elite in the world or the 1 million most elite, but how do we bring it to the next 3 billion people? And that's where you start to say, okay, it may not be as powerful as face-to-face coaching, but can it begin to help people who otherwise don't have the resources to work on it? Another colleague who's doing some work with Nikki on the ICF technology task force is Olivier. Blocking on his last name for a minute. My sincere apologies, Olivier. He's got a coaching bot with an avatar. Um, Ellen and Melvin and I, Christine Cush, who's in charge of our exec ed, just introduced us to a company that has actors and actresses, and that the person, the client, picks an avatar and uses this almost like Second Life um, uh, process to actually practice. Now, here it's not understanding or diagnosing. Here it's actually practicing skills. So, I think there's a huge range of possibilities. Do I ever think the machine will replace a human being? You know, no, I don't. But then again, I'm 75 and I was a psychotherapist. So how could I feel that a human with our authenticity and all the pheromones and other stuff wouldn't be important? Um, there's a part of me that feels like the ultimate humanistic and compassionate issue is that we use the face-to-face and supplement it with some of these other, the way we're using hybrid learning in a lot of higher education today may in fact have the most sustaining effects. But it's going to be research that's going to break the mold of our prejudices to try to help us.
So speaking of sustaining effects, there are a number of questions here in the Q&A about outcomes. So for example, Yvonne is asking a question about very specifically, how valid is evaluating coaching outcomes using quantitative, I think he meant qualitative, and subjective words such as good, great, perfect, and so on. So maybe you could talk just a little bit more about the various ways that we can measure outcomes, both in research and also in practice.
Well, and the way I think about it is, and I've been involved in outcome research in higher education since 1974. I mean, my former company had gotten a lot of funding from federal agencies. And then even I worked with groups that do the accreditation for professional schools. And I've been, because you were part of the research group when you were in your doctoral program that helped me with and did these studies with me, that when you go after looking at what are people learning, I have to ask the question, what's the value added? Because if you just ask what's the outcome, you can end up measuring what they were before. So to do value added, you really need to have longitudinal studies where you have
Mhm.
not just pre-post once, but maybe pre-post, post,
Mhm.
um, time series testing. Secondly, we all know that if a person doesn't come out of a developmental experience, whether it's coaching or school or whatever, feeling excited about it or curious or energized, that chances are it went nowhere. I mean, the one research study that looked at knowledge development showed that the half-life of knowledge from a required MBA course in accounting from a top 20 ranked program for these 28-year-olds was 6.5 weeks. And we know from the research and training and development that the honeymoon period is 3 weeks to 3 months, and then it's basically zero. So, what's sustainable? Well, feeling excited when you come out of it is not. But if you're not excited, chances are it's going nowhere. So client satisfaction is a credible measure. It's very subjective. You know, it
Mhm.
was just like one of our colleagues, do you remember, found out that if in the last class in her graduate course, if she brought in food, her course evaluations jumped. So there are all sorts of ways it can be manipulated. But nonetheless, it's an indicator. Now, if you add to that some of the intentional measures, and this is where the coaching research group at Sydney, that Anthony Grant and Michael Kavanaugh and Gordon Spence and the others have been a part of and led, they looked at, as you know, goal aspiration and goal intention. Do you intend to change this behavior? And they found that was powerful. It mirrored something that Dave Kolb and I found in some studies of behavior change back in 1970 with graduate students, that if they said they were going to change on something and we looked back a year later or 6 months later, do other people see the change? We found yes, it was more likely. So I actually think that's another level, but you have to cross check it. Now, the ultimate level is what I call the behavioral outcomes, because each of these are subject to, as you know, some form of measurement error and social desirability. But what we're doing when we go from, the smile sheets all the way to the behavioral, do other people around you think you've changed your behavior? Does the person you live with, your spouse, partner, significant other, roommate, see changes in your behavior now versus before? And if you say yes, then we have more confidence that the intervention worked, the
Mhm.
coaching worked. So it's not that they're valid or invalid. They're all valid to some extent. But the question is, how much confidence do we have that the thing that they're tapping is durable?
Right, right. And I would also add another way to get to those outcome measures, if you don't have uh, quantitative measures, is through your process of thematic analysis of qualitative information. So if you can use a very rigorous process to almost quantify verb like verbatim
Right.
data, either on a survey or in interviews, it's another way to get at some outcomes.
Yeah, and as you know, that in my 1998 textbook on doing thematic analysis with qualitative information, I strongly believe that the richness of data available is when you do what's called latent analysis. All too
Mm.
often, people have qualitative information, interviews or life history essays or transcriptions of meetings, and they apply word counting. Now, word counting is interesting, but that's like an axe. When you're trying to do surgery, you probably want a scalpel. So what happens is manifest content gives you just the gross surface. It's the latent content where you're able to use some human judgment about saying, what's the affect that's being demonstrated here? What's the context of the expression? But yes, there are ways to increase the reliability of that judgment and to make it, again, increase our confidence in it.
Mhm. So folks, those of you who have entered questions in the Q&A, you are asking really amazing, equally provocative questions, and I know we're not going to be able to get to all of them. Um, this is a kind of one of the key areas of coaching, and it relates to another question I saw earlier, but Brian's asking, what's been done in the area of research on team coaching, and what are the key needs and areas for team coaching going forward?
Yeah, that is a fantastically important area. And we had no sooner created the design for the future coaching sessions when I said, I wish we had the wherewithal to have a fourth session to focus on team coaching. And I've already talked to Dave Clutterbuck and a number of the other folks who are prolific scholars in this area. There of course has been a growing body of documentation and methods about how to do team coaching. And we are now seeing the development of research studies and publication of them. Now, some of it comes out of the field of team development. But as I think I can fairly say this, you've got one aspect of this arena is what does an individual coach do to help a team, an existing team develop? So whether you're going into a project team or an administrative team, how do you help them as a coach? That is team coaching. You also have another form of team coaching called peer coaching in groups, in which you may or may not have a facilitator or a coach helping them kick off, but then they proceed into the coaching with more of a self-managing, self-directed process. And then you have, which sometimes happens in the peer coaching in groups, the fact is that you're coaching, but in a team or group setting, but you're coaching individuals. Each of these three things are different. They each require research. I think we have probably the least research right now on the second two. The first one is coming along, but that's my reading of it. And I think what we need is all the same things we talked about with the outcome and the processes. I don't know what you would say about that, Angie, but I think all those same things need to be done with team coaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gets to another comment that was higher in our Q&A list. And I'm sorry that I've forgotten who made this comment, but the comment was talking about all of the different things that are being called coaching and how important it is for researchers to really define the construct. What are we talking about when we talk about coaching, and what are we not talking about? And then do that, repeat the various studies in each of those different sort of forms of coaching as the coaching field evolves, whether it's team coaching, group coaching, a manager coaching a subordinate versus professional coach. There's a lot of different configurations of what coaching looks like. And so I think many of the same questions we're asking about one-to-one coaching relationships need to be asked for other configurations as well.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time with Kathy Cram and Belrose Raggins when they were putting together the handbook of mentoring. You remember it? Because I think you had a chapter in it. Mm-hmm. And, personally, I see mentoring as a subset of coaching, not the other way around. Mm-hmm. And I also, as we did in our latest book, in our MOOC, I see coaching as one form of a process of helping. So I think every physician, every nurse, every manager, every cleric, every social worker, every therapist, every teacher, professor, every parent is a coach. Now, whether or not you formally say, I am a coach, and you print up business cards or your website, or you charge for it's another issue. But would your effectiveness in your role be increased if you're using more coaching processes and behaviors? Yes. And we are now starting to see the generation of articles, of studies applying, not parenting. That's the one I haven't seen yet, but you're doing some studies on mothers returning to work, right, Angie? So we'll be seeing this soon. But, physicians, we have one study that showed treatment adherence was really increased when the patient perceived the physician as tuning into their shared purpose or values, not just goals, their vision rather. So I think understanding this is going to be very important. And I think to try to create more and more separation of these things isn't going to be helpful. I actually think understanding what parts of the coaching act and process are important for people in various helping roles will actually help us more. But that's my view. Other people may want more distinct definitions.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to just raise one last question for you that really transitions us from the research into the practice and profession. And so Claudia is asking, coaches usually call coaching a profession. What do you think coaching needs to really truly become a profession?
A profession in sociological terms is defined by an activity that warrants a separate name or role: physician, architect, engineer, nurse, teacher, requires specialized training and requires certification. Those are the actual three sociological definitions. Is coaching a profession? Yes. Is using coaching in any helping relationship a part of every helping profession? Yes. So I think that the separate profession of coaching will continue to be strengthened as we build the foundation of our intellectual house. And that's what all this research will do. I mean, every time we do some more research studies, the foundation gets sounder. Will we also help to broaden the use of coaching processes and practices for a lot of other people? Yes, because that's the promise of building cultures of development or cultures of coaching in organizations, so people can benefit from the norms and the values, not just the activity. Can I ask one more question to the audience?
Absolutely.
This is a personal request for research. If you are a coach and you're a native English speaker or you're comfortable, fluent English, please volunteer for our study. I've been doing this, recruiting for this study on coaches of competencies. We need about 35 minutes of your time to fill out some surveys. Then give us 3 to 5 names of peers that can talk about in the 360 how you act. And then when you start a new coaching relationship, you find a client, you ask them for 20 minutes of time to fill out some things, surveys, and then we'll come back to them a year later. I know it's a burden. I know it interferes possibly with the specialness of it, but we're not going to begin to get a foundation on the competencies unless we get that. So, I don't know, Angie, if you can load the URL or let people know what it is, but
I don't have the URL at my fingertips, but what we can do, Richard, is send it out with our follow-up information so that everyone will have it and have it in a more semi-permanent format.
Right.
But I think,
Thank
to me, this is sort of like I'm participating in a clinical trial. But if you're the coach, in some ways, you're leading the clinical trial because you're asking your clients to enroll as well as you. So Richard, I want to say thank you for not only your time today, but for all that you've done to advance our field, to help to establish this important foundation, intellectual foundation for our collective work. Thank you again for being here today. We look forward to many future conversations with you. For those of you who are on the call, as you know, the JABS article is free. Richard, one question came up about, are people able to post this on their websites, the JABS article? Do you know what the copyright?
Yes, you're not allowed to post the article, but you can post the DOI. So anybody, because it's open, we paid extra to have it open access. So anybody anywhere in the world, all you need is a phone or an internet connection, can access it. You can post the DOI and the title and
Great, and link the DOI then to the JABS
right.
homepage where people can download the article themselves. Wonderful, Thank you for doing that. IOC members who are on the call, I wanted to remind you that you have access to a tremendous database of subscription-only journals with full text articles on our website. I see that many of you have posted links to articles you've written. Thank you for those links. If you're not able to get those free access, you can log into your account through the IOC. You can go to journals, our resources and journals page, and you can access several databases that way and likely get the articles that you're looking for. I'd also like to remind you of another resource for IOC members, which is our next webinar on May 12th at 11 a.m. on the topic of age diversity, why it matters for coaches with Adrian Porter. And then finally, if you're not a member and you're interested in becoming a member of the Institute of Coaching, I would encourage you to explore the various options that there are for becoming involved. And Sue, if you could post a link there, if you haven't already, to our membership, that would be fabulous. It's also on our website. And with that, we're just a couple minutes over. I will say goodbye for now. Thank you. Yours in coaching. Hope to see you at a future event. Goodbye, everyone.